Gorvin Seth read the declaration aloud in the War Council chamber. He always read declarations aloud. It was a personal practice, not a protocol requirement. Declarations were formal documents, and formal documents deserved a voice. The words needed to be in the air before they went into the record. The declaration was 4 pages. He read it in 12 minutes. The substance was clear. The Kareth Dominion hereby declared a state of armed conflict with the Terran Collective, citing 8 years of accumulated territorial grievances, resource extraction disputes, and what the document described as deliberate and sustained diplomatic evasion by Terran representatives in bad faith. The declaration cited specific incidents, border crossings, supply disruptions, station seizures that had been contested and never resolved. It cited the Accord's repeated failure to produce a framework that satisfied Kareth interests. It cited, in the final paragraph, the military assessment that the Terran Collective's defense capability was insufficient to contest a Karath fleet engagement at any scale above minor skirmish. He read that final paragraph twice, not for the record, for himself. The military assessment was thorough. It had been commissioned 18 months ago from the Karath's best analysts. It cited force numbers, ship classifications, production capacity, the state of Earth's orbital installations, the defensive posture of the outer colonies. It concluded, with the specific confidence of a document that had been reviewed by senior staff and found without significant objection, that the Terran Collective was a manageable military target. Seth had read it 3 times before signing the declaration. He had found no significant objections either. He finished reading. He set the document down. He looked around the council chamber at 11 of his most experienced colleagues. "Questions?" he said. There were none. He signed it. He would spend a long time, afterward, thinking about those 12 minutes, about the specific quality of certainty that had been in the room, about 11 experienced people and 0 questions. He would think about what 12 minutes of silence before a declaration of war against a species you had not properly studied actually meant. He would think about it for the rest of his life. Intelligence Chief Drev Nal had been reading his own reports for 6 days. Not reviewing them, reading them, the way you read something when you are looking for the moment you went wrong. All of it. The 8-year archive, the quarterly assessments, the incident reports, the behavioral analysis memos, the capability estimates. 942 pages of analysis, all of it his, all of it feeding the conclusion that had ended up in the military assessment that Seth had read twice before signing. He found the error on day 2. It was not a data error. The facts in his reports were accurate. The incidents were correctly documented. The force numbers were correctly sourced. The diplomatic evasion characterization was technically defensible. None of the individual facts were wrong. The error was in the framework. He had been assessing Earth's behavior against a model he had developed over 20 years of studying species in pre-conflict situations. The model was good. It had correctly predicted the behavioral trajectories of 7 species before the Kareth engaged them. It was based on a set of correlations between restraint and capability. Species that did not respond to provocation were, in the model, species that could not respond. Restraint was the behavior of the weak. The model had never encountered a species that restrained itself by choice. He sat with this for 4 days. He went back through the 8 years of incident reports and read them with a different question. Not, what does this behavior indicate about their capability? But, what does this behavior indicate about their decision? The answer that emerged was different from everything in his official reports. Earth had not responded to the border crossing incidents because Earth had assessed correctly, as it turned out that responding to the incidents individually would produce escalation without resolution. They had not contested the resource extractions because the extractions were smaller than the cost of the conflict that contesting them would produce. They had absorbed every provocation with what he had characterized as restraint, and what was, reading it now with different eyes, something more specific: patience. Patient restraint, not submissive restraint. He wrote a memo. A private one, not for the record, because the record already contained enough of his errors. He wrote, "I assessed their silence as evidence of limitation. It was evidence of calculation. The silence was not what they could not do. It was what they had decided not to do yet." He paused. He wrote, "Yet." He put his pen down. He thought about the word yet. He picked up his communication device and called someone he had not spoken to in 4 years, a junior analyst who had been assigned to the Earth file 7 years ago and who had been reassigned after submitting a dissenting memo that Null had declined to include in the official quarterly report. The analyst's name was Pren. Pren picked up immediately. "You found it," Pren said. "Not a question." "Yes," Null said. "Page 47 of the Year 3 assessment," Pren said. "The behavioral baseline. You weighted restraint as incapacity." "I know," Null said. "I submitted a memo." "I know," Null said. "I declined it." A pause. "Why are you calling me?" Pren said. "Because I declined your memo," Null said, "and I need to understand why you were right." Another pause. "The fishing vlog," Pren said. "What?" "Do you remember the Earth cultural monitoring files from Year 2? There was an intercepted personal communication from a human colonist stationed on Veth Reach. He had been on that colony for 6 months. The colony had been under economic pressure from us for 3 of those months. Supply disruptions, resource extraction, the standard toolkit." Pren paused. The colonist's communication was to his family. It described how he had spent his rest days. Null waited. "He was fishing," Pren said. "He had found a native species in the water system, developed a method for catching them, and was sending his family a recording of himself catching them." Pren stopped. He seemed happy. He was living under significant economic pressure in a contested outer colony, and he was recording himself fishing and sending it home. Another pause. "That colonist's communication was in the file as incidental cultural data. I flagged it. I wrote in my memo, a species that responds to pressure by learning to fish is not a species that is overwhelmed by pressure." Null sat with that. "You flagged a fishing video," he said. "I flagged what the fishing video indicated," Pren said. "It indicated adaptation, comfort in adverse conditions. Not desperation, not collapse adaptation. Domestication of the situation." He paused. "I wrote in the memo that a species capable of adapting to pressure rather than being broken by it was a species whose restraint should not be read as incapacity." "I declined the memo," Null said. "You declined it," Pren said, "because it was based on one cultural data point that seemed anecdotal." "Yes." "And now 40 ships are." "Yes," Null said. The line was quiet. "What do you need from me?" Pren said. "I need to understand," Null said. "Not for the record, for myself. The fishing video was one data point. You built an entire dissenting assessment from one data point. Why were you confident enough to dissent?" "Because it wasn't one data point," Pren said. "It was the most legible version of a pattern that appeared across every Earth cultural file I reviewed. Humans under pressure don't collapse. They get interested. They look for what the situation offers and they use it." He paused. "We were providing pressure for 8 years. We were not watching what they were building with it." Null set his pen down. He thought about 942 pages. He thought about the fishing video on page 47 of Year 3. He thought about the declaration of war that Seth had signed 11 days ago. He thought, we spent 8 years giving them a reason. We were not watching what they were doing with it. Orvan had been ready for 11 years. Not in the way that soldiers were always supposed to be ready, the professional readiness of maintained equipment and updated training and current briefings. In a specific, personal, particular way that had developed when he was 28 years old and had read, in an intelligence file he was not supposed to have access to, a summary of Karath border activity in the outer sectors. The summary had been 3 pages. It had described, in the flat language of intelligence reporting, 7 incidents in 12 months that each individually read as ambiguous and collectively read, to Orvan, at 28, as unmistakably clear. They were coming. Not soon, not in the time frame that most of his superiors were thinking about, but with the specific patience of a species that had expanded by this method many times before and knew how to apply pressure incrementally without triggering a response before they were ready. He had written a memo, his first memo, at 28, on the third day of his assignment to the Outer Sector Defense Planning Division. The memo had been 3 pages, matching the intelligence summary. It had outlined a timeline, 8 to 12 years before active hostilities, based on the rate of pressure escalation and the historical pattern of Kareth pre-conflict behavior. It had outlined what Earth should be building in those 8 to 12 years. It had outlined in the final section what the engagement would look like if Earth built it and what it would look like if Earth didn't. His commanding officer at the time, a man named Hevron who had since retired, had read the memo, handed it back, and said, "Son, you cannot build a war plan on a hunch." "It's not a hunch," Orvan had said. "It's pattern recognition." Hevron had said, "File it." He had filed it. He had written a second memo 6 months later, incorporating new data. Filed it. A third memo a year after that. Filed. In 11 years, he had written 31 memos, each one updated with current intelligence, each one refining the timeline and the engagement parameters. The first had estimated 8 to 12 years. By Memo 27, he had it down to a range of 1 to 18 months. Memo 31 had been written 4 months ago. It had said, "The declaration is imminent. Based on the current escalation rate and the Karath's historical pattern, engagement should be expected within the next 6 months. The following deployment positions should be established immediately." He had filed it. 2 weeks later, Commander Shen from the Defense Planning Division had called him in. "Your memo," Shen had said. "Yes," Orvan had said. "The deployment positions." "Yes." Shen had looked at him for a moment. "We've been reading your memos, all 31. Orvan had said nothing. "The timeline has been—" Shen stopped. "Uncomfortably accurate." "Yes," Orvan said. "The deployment positions in Memo 31, Shen said. "How confident are you?" "Completely," Orvan said. Shen had looked at him for another moment. "Start deploying," he had said. That had been 4 months ago. The declaration had come 6 weeks later. Orvan's units had been in position for 3.5 months when the Kareth fleet entered engagement range. The Karath fleet crossed into contested space with 42 ships in standard battle formation. They had chosen the approach vector based on the intelligence assessment, the vector that minimized exposure to Earth's documented defensive capabilities, the one that gave the fleet maximum freedom of movement and the human defensive position's minimum reaction time. The intelligence assessment had not known about Orvan's deployment positions. The intelligence assessment had been working from documentation of Earth's defensive posture as it existed 8 months ago. 4 months of deployment activity had not appeared in the assessment because the Kareth's intelligence collection on Earth's interior dispositions had a gap Nal's team had flagged 18 months ago as a risk, and had not been allocated resources to close because the official assessment said Earth was a manageable target, and manageable targets did not require maximum intelligence collection priority. The Karath fleet crossed the threshold. Orvan was in his command position when the first contact report came in. 42 ships, standard formation, approach vector exactly as Memo 31 had projected. He had projected it specifically enough that his units were already oriented in the correct direction to receive it. He looked at his tactical display. He thought about 31 memos, about 11 years. He gave 3 orders. Not a speech, not a briefing, 3 orders, in sequence, the specific commands that unlocked the deployment positions he had been building toward for 4 months and preparing for 11 years. The first order activated the outer ring. The second order activated the corridor closures. The third order, 20 seconds later, released the reserve. The engagement lasted 4 minutes and 7 seconds. Not because the human force was overwhelmingly superior on a ship-for-ship basis. Karath vessels were comparable to Earth's. The engagement lasted 4 minutes and 7 seconds because, in 4 months of deployment, Orvan had positioned his units in the specific places that Memo 31 had identified as the positions from which the projected Karath approach vector could be engaged simultaneously from 3 directions, which was a thing the Karath fleet's formation was not designed to handle, which Orvan knew because he had spent 11 years reading everything available about Karath fleet doctrine and had identified, in Memo 23, the specific formation vulnerability that the approach vector created. The Karath had chosen the approach vector to minimize their exposure to Earth's defensive capabilities. They had chosen, without knowing it, the vector that Orvan had been waiting 11 years for them to choose. 31 of the 42 ships did not complete the engagement. The remaining 11 withdrew. Orvan filed his engagement report that night. It was 4 pages. The last line read, "Deployment positions as specified in Memo 31. Engagement outcome as projected in Memo 31. Timeline within the range estimated in Memo 1. He had been 28 when he wrote Memo 1. He was 39 now. He filed the report and went to sleep. Seth received the engagement report 48 hours after the battle. He read it once. Then he read it again. Then he requested everything available on the human officer who had commanded the engagement, the full file, the service record, the memos. He read the memos. All 31 of them. He read them in order. He read Memo 1 first, the 3-page document written by a 28-year-old officer projecting an 8 to 12-year timeline before active hostilities. He read Memo 2. He read through to Memo 31. By Memo 15, he had stopped making notes and was simply reading. By Memo 23, he had found the vulnerability analysis, the specific identification of the formation weakness that the approach vector created, written 4 years ago, filed, and apparently used to determine where to place the units that had just destroyed 31 of his ships. He set the file down. He thought about the declaration. About 12 minutes of reading and 11 colleagues and 0 questions. About the military assessment that he had read 3 times and found without significant objection. He thought about 31 memos that a human officer had filed over 11 years in what appeared to be the complete absence of anyone telling him to stop. He thought about what kind of institution produced an officer who wrote Memo 1 at 28 and kept writing through 31 without external validation or significant response, sustained across 11 years by the specific certainty of someone who had read the pattern correctly and had decided to keep being ready for it, regardless of whether anyone was listening. He thought about the phishing video. He did not know about the phishing video specifically that was in Nal's private notes. But he thought about what the memos represented, which was the same thing the phishing video represented. A species that, when placed under pressure, got interested. They had spent 8 years providing pressure. They had not watched what Earth was building with it. Memo 31 had been written 4 months ago and had contained, in its deployment section, the exact positions that had destroyed 31 of his ships. He had signed the declaration 11 days ago. Memo 31 had been written 4 months before that. He sat with that arithmetic for a very long time. Then he opened a communication channel to his war council. "We need to talk," he said. Nal filed a second memo 14 days after the engagement. This one went into the official record. Not under his name, he submitted it under a joint attribution with Pren, whose dissenting memo from 7 years ago he attached in full as an appendix. The memo was titled, "Assessment Error in Pre-Declaration Analysis of Terran Collective Behavioral Profile, Cause, Nature, and Recommended Revision." The cause, as the memo described it, was a framework error, the application of a restraint as incapacity model to a species whose restraint was strategic rather than structural. The model had been calibrated against species whose silence indicated limitation. It had not accounted for silence as a form of preparation. The nature of the error was systematic. Because the framework had produced accurate predictions for 7 previous species, it had not been questioned when applied to the 8th. The error was not in the data. The data was correct. The error was in the assumption that the same framework that worked for 7 species with one type of silence would work for a species with a different type. The recommended revision was thorough. It proposed a new behavioral assessment protocol that included, as a mandatory element, what Nall called the response to pressure analysis. Not just what a species did or did not do in response to provocation, but the quality of what they did. What did they adapt? What did they build? What did they learn? The appendix included the fishing video. Nall had gone back and found it in the archive. Pren had been right. It was in the Year 3 file, page 47, flagged as incidental cultural data. He had included it in the appendix with a single line of annotation. This communication was available in the Year 3 file and was correctly identified in a dissenting memo by analyst Pren as indicating adaptive rather than submissive restraint. The dissenting memo was declined. The communication should have been weighted more heavily. He filed the memo. He did not know if it would produce anything. Institutional revision moved slowly. The War Council was processing the engagement. Seth was processing the engagement. Everyone was processing the engagement, and the processing produced meetings and committees and review bodies, all of which would eventually produce something that may or may not resemble what the memo recommended. What he knew was that the memo was in the record. Pren's dissenting memo was in the record. The fishing video was in the record with correct annotation. The next analyst who worked the Earth file would find it. The next analyst who worked any file with a similar behavioral profile would find it. That was something. He closed his console. He went home for the first time in 14 days. The debrief lasted 3 days. Not because the engagement was complicated. The engagement was 4 minutes and 7 seconds, and Orvan's report covered it in 4 pages. The debrief lasted 3 days because his commanding officers wanted to understand the 31 memos. They had read them. They wanted to understand what kind of thinking produced them. He explained, as clearly as he could. Memo 1 was pattern recognition, he said. The Karath had done this before, 7 times against other species. The sequence is consistent. Economic pressure, diplomatic provocation, assessment of response, escalation calibrated to the assessed response. Each step tells them something about what the target is. Each step narrows their uncertainty. He paused. The thing they're measuring, in every step, is how the target responds to pressure. And Earth didn't respond, his commanding officer, Admiral Shen, promoted since authorizing the deployment, said. Earth didn't respond visibly, Orvan said. That's different. We were responding. We were just not responding in the way they expected, and in the way their model was calibrated to read. How were we responding? We were building, Orvan said. Every incident told us something about them. The border crossings told us about their approach vectors. The supply disruptions told us about their priority hierarchies, which resources they wanted most, which they were willing to sacrifice. The diplomatic provocations told us about their timeline thinking, their patience threshold, their communication style under pressure. He paused. 8 years of provocations gave us 8 years of intelligence. We just didn't respond to any of it in a way they could see. Because we were watching, Shen said. Because we were watching, Orvan said. Shen was quiet for a moment. He was not a man who sat quietly often. He was a decisive administrator, accustomed to making calls and moving. He sat quietly now. Memo 1, he said. You wrote it in your 3rd week. 3rd day, Orvan said. Shen looked at him. You read a 3-page intelligence summary in your 3rd day and projected an 8 to 12-year timeline to active hostilities. Yes, Orvan said. How? Orvan thought about how to explain it. He thought about 28-year-old himself, sitting with a 3-page file that everyone else was reading as ambiguous. He thought about what he had seen in it that the others hadn't. It was the consistency, he said. Every individual incident was ambiguous. Any single one could be read as opportunistic or accidental or a miscalculation. But the sequence had a shape. The intervals between incidents were decreasing at a specific rate. The scale of each incident was increasing at a specific rate. The diplomatic response to each protest was calibrated at a specific level of dismissiveness. He paused. Any one of those could be noise. All three together, maintaining consistent rates across 7 incidents in 12 months. That's not noise. That's a process. A process that took 8 more years, Shen said. Yes, Orvan said. I was 28. I didn't know how patient they were. I updated the timeline in Memo 2 when I had more data. And kept updating. Every time new data changed the projection, Orvan said. That's what the memos were, running updates on a projection that I believed was accurate and that the data kept confirming. Shen looked at the stack of memos on the table between them. 31 memos, he said. 11 years. Yes, Orvan said. Not once in 11 years did you conclude you were wrong. Orvan thought about it honestly. Memo 19, he said. I had a period of about 3 months where the Karath activity leveled off in a way that didn't match the escalation model. I wrote in Memo 19 that I was revising the confidence level from high to moderate and noted that I might be misreading the pattern. He paused. Then the activity resumed in month 4, and I revised back up in Memo 20. 3 months of doubt in 11 years. The data didn't support doubt for longer than that, Orvan said. I was right to revise the confidence level when the data was ambiguous. I was right to revise it back when the ambiguity resolved. Shen sat with that. What do we do now? He said. With what you know. With what the engagement established. Orvan looked at the table. Now, he said, we watch them respond to what we did, the same way they were watching us respond to what they were doing. He paused. The engagement told them something. About our positions, our capabilities, our doctrine. They're going to read it the way I read their border incidents, carefully. And they're going to adjust. He looked at Shen. We need to be reading their adjustment the same way they're going to be reading our engagement. Already watching, Shen said. Already watching, Orvan said. Yes. Shen looked at him for a moment. You know what they're going to do next, he said. It was not quite a question. I have a projection, Orvan said. Is it in a memo? Memo 32, Orvan said. Filed this morning. The silence after the engagement was different from the silence before it. Before, the Karath had read Earth's silence as weakness and had spent 8 years using that misreading to advance. Earth's silence had been strategic, patient, watchful, building. After, the Karath were silent because they were processing, not because they were weak. Because Seth had read 31 memos and had understood, in the specific way you understood something when it was demonstrated to you with 31 ships, that he had misread the situation. Nal was silent because he was revising the framework that had produced the misreading. The revision was going to take months. It was going to be uncomfortable. It was going to require, at several points, the specific institutional discomfort of admitting that 7 successful predictions had produced an overconfidence in a model that had failed on the 8th. Pren was not silent. Pren had been asked to lead the behavioral assessment revision team. He had said yes. He had begun, on his first day, by pulling the phishing video. Orvan was not silent either. He was writing Memo 33. Memo 33 was a projection of Karath doctrine revision, what changes they would make in response to the engagement, what vulnerabilities those changes would introduce, and what Earth's positioning should look like in response to the projected revised doctrine. He was 39 years old. He had been writing memos for 11 years. He had no expectation that 33 would be the last one. He had a projection loose, contingency heavy, requiring significant updating, as data came in that the current situation would require sustained engagement across a period he estimated at another 8 to 12 years before it resolved into something stable. He had been 28 when he first estimated 8 to 12 years. He was better at this now. He wrote. The memos accumulated. The data came in. The projections updated. That was the work. The Karath had spent 8 years watching silence and reading it as weakness. Earth had spent 8 years in that silence. Not being weak. Being ready. And now the Karath were learning to read silence differently. Learning, as Naal's revised framework would eventually describe, that silence was not evidence of limitation, that restraint could be calculation, that patience could be preparation. The galaxy, slowly, was learning what Earth had always known. Silence was not nothing. Silence was what you did while you were getting ready. And Earth had been getting ready for a very long time,